Okay, great. Well, so one of the things that was really interesting to me in your talk was the kind of water as identity idea in the identity of the urban area. And so how do you think that urban planners and designers can kind of leverage that water as identity for climate resilience planning or for urban planning today?
Oh, I think it has much to do with local situations. First of all, how cities are built upon water or live with water or live without water. So I think you can only know more about this if you dig a little bit into history also, and look at the urban forms that water can generate. There are so many different urban forms. If you think from Venice to Amsterdam to New York, I mean, all of these cities are kind of water cities, but they are so different one to each other. So yes, of course, the identity is very much related with that kind of water-related forms of cities. And I think that in urban design, they are very formal ways of knowing about this. The so-called typomorphological studies, for instance. But I think it also has to do with more social related questions, like what kind of customs and not customs, but rituals and that kind of things people have towards the water, because it can differ from one city to another, how you live with it.
Yeah, it's especially salient here in the Bay Area. I think it's a whole metropolitan region built around the Bay, and sometimes people even refer to the region as the Bay. I'm from the Bay, so
Right.
it's very much an integral part of our identity here. It's interesting because I never have really heard much about urban planning in the Bay that is trying to leverage that water identity. So.
Well, I don't know so well the Bay a little bit. I traveled around the Bay a little bit, and especially the relationship with water is there are very different relationships, I think, because sometimes you can even not get to the water. I remember that it's very difficult to get close to the water at certain points, at many points actually, and so I know that in certain countries I'm speaking about Europe, that the relationship to the seashore is became progressively a kind of a protected right to the citizens. So you have this in England and the UK. You have this very strong, much stronger, I think, even in France, where all the shorelines are by definition public. You cannot appropriate actually the shoreline normally. So the country or the national administration is also buying up lots of or even expropriating shorelines to get them back to the public. So I think if the Bay Area wants to have a good relationship with water, they should probably do something about that. About this point. And the second point is also infrastructure, because there's lots of highway infrastructure and railway infrastructure that traditionally was built sometimes very close to the shoreline, because it was a kind of a wasted land or a kind of an unused land. So it was very easy to build there. But now today we see how much it closes the land off from this the joy of getting close to the water. So I think that's I think 2 points which are very important. For instance, there have been cities like Genova in Italy, where you had kind of railways, also Barcelona, railways and viaducts and highways that made it completely impossible to get to the sea. And so in the last 20 years, there was a huge intervention to get rid of all these infrastructure to other sites, even to get rid of industrial sites out of the city, and so to have a kind of a waterfront again, close to the city of inhabitants.
Wow,
So
that's
yeah,
inspiring. Yeah.
yeah, I think the Bay Area probably also could, but I know that in the Bay Area there are wonderful shorelines actually also. I'm not denigrating the Bay Area, and I don't remember the names, but in the north of the Bay Area, north of there are places where you have a beautiful view in San Francisco on the shoreline where you can sit on a bench. And so yeah, I think that kind of new relationship in leisure time is extremely important, I think, today with water. Yeah. Yeah, well, there's so much to say about this because also it's not only about beaches and things like that. It's also about I think a kind of an active relationship with the water, not only by sports and things like that, but also knowing more about the water. So there are now several didactical centers and also shorelines where you can learn about what our relationship is, our biological relationship is with water. So it's also kind of a learning environment, I think, more and more that we have to care about.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah. And I was amazed by the Bay Area, but by all these different kinds of shores, actually, because there's a lot of marshy land that goes into the sea or in the bay. There's also some more rocky coastlines. So I think there's a lot of inventive design to make at the Bay Area about this. So I would encourage people responsible for designing programs to work on these missions, actually.
Yeah, well, so I was really curious. I really liked the part of your talk where you kind of detailed the renovations along the River Scheldt, the levee and the banks, so that people could have access to the water. And this is also a big conversation here in the Bay Area, is, how do we adapt to sea level rise? And I was really interested in kind of the design of that adaptation along the Scheldt, that it's this big kind of expanse of cement, or I couldn't tell, tile or cement. Was there a conversation about kind of that material? And was there, in the Bay Area, there's a big push to try to do these adaptation measures with kind of more natural or green materials? And was there a similar conversation there? Or how did that kind of,
Well, that's a good question. The quays in front of the city, which were made in the 19th century, and I talked about it also in my conversation, when they made this straight line for the port in front of the city in the 19th century, were huge works and with lots of demolition of houses and things like that. So the decision to make was very heavy, actually, for the municipality and also for because it's also a state level decision, actually, this kind of huge works. But they made a beautiful design at that moment in the 19th century with, and even if it was just for industrial purposes, because the surface of the quay was made of a kind of porphyr. I don't know, it's a stone. It's a very hard stone, which you can find in the country, in Belgium and north of France, and like cobblestones, actually cobblestones, a certain kind of cobblestone. So the surface was completely horizontal and flat, of about 150 meters wide and 2 or 3 kilometers long. And the border of this surface at the point where it goes down into the river was made of what they call the bluestone, which is kind of a chalk, a very hard chalk stone. And so the design of it was very simple but very beautiful. And then you had these boulders every 50 meters or something for the ships. And it was so simple. And then you had some warehouses on top of it in cast iron and iron, which were beautifully designed, also very simple with these shed decks, roofs. And this landscape was very much used by industry, but it almost didn't alter. It was so very well designed, so strong that after more than 100 years, it was still the same. And so 20, 30, 40 years ago, the harbor started to go to other sites. And so these areas were abandoned more and more. And people started to discover these areas as walking areas where they went when it was sunny, but also when there was rainy time or fog, and it was such a very special atmosphere. It still is. And they refer to this area as the Blue Stone. The Blue Stone is when you say, I go to the Blue Stone, then you go to the quays of Antwerp, actually, because that's an identity also that we were talking about. And as it is so present in the collective memory of the people of Antwerp, they wanted to keep it also after the competition and after the new design for the new case. So most of the designers, the competition was in 2005 or 2006. So most of the designers did a lot of effort to keep this atmosphere of the case in different ways, but it was one of the main points of attention, actually. Besides the technical attention and the protection against the rising water level. And the final design now, the designers that have been designated, which is an office from Portugal and Belgium that work together. What they did is they lifted up a little bit the surface of the quay, almost invisibly, because it's very, very smooth going up. And so the horizontal surface became a little bit tilted, but almost, well, you can see it, but not very visible. And the material, these cobblestones are still the same, more or less the same. So it still is this open space with the bluestone and the cobblestones where you can walk, and now you have a kind of a more leveled landscape, which is beautiful actually to walk. So the design is really it's very successful, and I think it's very important to take this into account when you shape this new relationship with the water. It will be done in so many cities in the next years, because so many cities all over the world will have to raise the level of the quays and also along the rivers and everything. So it's a huge challenge for designers, I think, that is now coming up. So yeah, I think Antwerp can be I think a kind of good example. I mean, it's not, of course, not the only one, but it's a kind of good example, I think, for designers. And if people want to visit the city of Antwerp, I think it's worthwhile to come. And yeah, at the same time, I think at cities like Venice, where they will have well, they have the same kind of problem since many years, and the solution is still not there, and for many reasons. And the design challenge will be more and more huge in the coming years. So it's also a kind of a proactive challenge that cities should not wait too long about this, because it needs a long time of reflection to deal with these problems in a good way, because otherwise you will see concrete walls, for instance, because in Antwerp also there was a kind of a concrete wall since 50 years, but it was only 1.25 meters high, just until here, for emergency rising water levels when it was storm and everything. And so they had a kind of a wall along those quays at the side of the city that could close with gates. There were like rolling gates that could roll in a very short time to close off the city from inundation. But that wall still it was not a nice solution. It was very functional, and it was bothering everybody because it's an obstacle to go to the river. You have to go around the wall. And so now it's actually much better. It's much better, but it takes time. It takes time.
Yeah, right. It is such a challenge to think about, protecting infrastructure and buildings from flooding while also maintaining access to the water. That's the key.
Right. Yeah. Well, there are other solutions, and Antwerp, I mean, there is for the whole of Belgium and Flanders, especially because Flanders is a lower part of Belgium. There was a huge plan. They call it the Sigma plan, with the letter Sigma. It's a plan that was made in the 70s against inundation. And well, it's another example of how people should reflect on these challenges, because the plan of the 70s was a kind of a very hard plan. I mean, very tough and very radical plan. And it was just to border the rivers with dikes and make rivers more straight so that the water could go off to the sea very easily. And so many rivers have now these mixture of stone and earth dikes along very linear trajectories of the rivers. And it was made because there was a kind of an urgency 50 years ago. And but now they will have to raise the level of those dikes again. So they took a certain time to think about this, and this radical solution and this very fast evacuation of water was, of course, the wrong solution 50 years ago, as we know now, because we should keep the water as long as possible inside the land without inundating the cities and villages. But you can still inundate land. You can still inundate kind of wasteland and marshlands and natural surfaces. So the new Sigma plan, or the new plan now, is taking this into account, and it's making lots of new, very, how do you call it, almost adventurous environments where water can come into the land, inundate the land for a certain moment, and then go off again, and create kind of new biological, natural kind of in between marsh and dry land, which is it creates beautiful landscapes, because there's lots of new plants coming by themselves, and also animals and birds. And so I think it's wonderful if you can deal with this now today at the same time, because of course the challenges are scary, and at the same time we have to deal with it. So why not in an intelligent way, better than 50 years ago? So yeah, I think the Netherlands are also doing this even in a much bigger scale than in Flanders or Belgium, and these are completely new landscapes that we didn't know since many centuries actually. You had this kind of landscapes in the 19th and 18th century when, for instance, they worked with winter dikes and summer dikes. So when you have tidal rivers, you can have a summer dike where the water, when there's not a lot of water, where the water can run off. But you can have winter dikes, and winter dikes are bordering a much larger territory, so that in winter these much huge surfaces sometimes can inundate during winter, and then the winter goes off when spring comes, and this land is of course very fertile that is left over, and so they use it to grow reed, for instance, and that kind of stuff that can be used in making I don't know, baskets and all this kind of stuff. That was 100 and 200 years ago. So people were much more clever than we are with how to deal with water and our land surfaces. So let's not go back, but let's revisit these times again and their intelligence, to see how they dealt with, in sometimes a very easy way. I mean, that you don't need a lot of infrastructure to do this. It's just a point of organization. That's the most important point that we don't manage sometimes anymore, to have the political force and power and decision making to do this kind of things. That's sometimes the most difficult problem.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, it's also very relevant to here, not so much to the Bay Area, the Bay proper, but to the San Francisco Bay Delta, which we have this inland delta, as you might remember from when you were here. And there are levees, big levees, that there's places where the land is 30 feet below the water, and they're old, and there's just a lot of, there's a lot of inaction, but it would be, such a nice solution to have an area where the land could naturally flood, a big open area, so that there wasn't so much concern about protecting, lives, and just building the levees higher.
Right. I've seen some very interesting watery landscapes in the Bay Area in the northeast, if I
yes, exactly.
situate this. It's absolutely fabulous landscapes, and it's there's so much done there already with all these canalizations at the same time, beautiful dikes also, and so, but it's also, it's not very accessible actually. I mean, or it's not very much, how to say, I don't know if people know about this actually a lot, but if you go there, it's wonderland. It's very, very beautiful, but it's also, I have been there and I felt sometimes a little bit not at ease, because I felt in private land actually, and I didn't know if I could go there or not, and so I don't know how to deal with this kind of, if you can make it more accessible or not, or but yeah, it was very beautiful. There's also the same kind of wildlife land, which is now kept untouched, where you have all these birds coming for breeding, and all these yeah, it's yeah, it was a real pleasure to be there. So I think there's a lot going on already in the Bay Area, and I don't know much about this, but I'm sure that there are very good examples of what happens there.
Yeah. Well, to kind of change the topic a little bit, I was really interested in your talk by kind of the competition, the water in the city competition. And oh, sorry about the noise. I'm curious about the role of competitions in designing the urban form, or designing more resilient urban areas.
Yeah, well, this was a very important competition in 1990 in Antwerp. It was at a moment that there was a lot of post-industrial remainders from the early 20th century, 19th century, that was not used anymore. The whole area of the harbor in the north, the quays. So at that moment, the decision was made not by the authorities, but by the people of Antwerp, by a group of people of Antwerp, among whom you had architects and but also more writers and people just interested in the history of the city. And they took the initiative to start a reflection on those areas and also to start to look for a new design for these areas. And that's where the idea of the competition came up. So they organized an international competition for these areas. And it was made of three areas, three different kinds of areas. And it was at the same time an open competition. That's a competition that is accessible for all those who want to participate, and also a closed consultation, as they call it. It's asking 4 or 5 teams to, and they pay them, they will be paid for it, just to make a kind of a deep new reflection and a plan for those areas. So you had both kind of competitions that were organized at that moment, and it was for the city of Antwerp, but for a much larger region, a kind of pilot project. I mean, this was kind of it. Other cities wanted to follow the example of Antwerp, and the competition as a format was 10 years later introduced as an institutional format by what they call the chief architect of the region of Flanders. So there's a kind of administrative architect who supervises public projects. And so he installed this format of it was called the open call. And the open call it's a format where every year they make a kind of a long list of people who would be interested to participate at competitions, architects' offices. So this long list, every time when there is a public competition that a municipality would like to organize, they take the long list. The chief architect takes the long list, and he chooses 10 or 15 teams which look like well positioned to participate in the competition. So the open call is a kind of a long list of people where the chief architect can choose teams to participate at certain competitions which are fit for that kind of teams and offices. And more and more you had public competitions thanks to this format, actually. And so you have in every city at least 1 or 2 competitions in the last 25 years that were set up with this format. So you need an administrative form for competitions. And so it exists on the level of this national and regional level. It also exists on the European level, because there is now also a very strict legislation for competitions. From what financial level they should be an open competition and not a kind of a immediate, how do you call this, a commission to one designer, but an open competition to many designers. So that kind of legislation is now also very productive and extremely used to for all kinds of design competitions for infrastructure renewal and all kinds of competitions, because they have to. I mean, it's law, so they have to organize them on the European level.
Cool.
Yeah, I think that it's yeah, competitions are at the same time. It's always a competition is so interesting. I mean, I'm not learning new a lot, but it is so interesting to see how every competition is a kind of concentration of energy of 5 or 6 or 10 groups of people who invest a lot of energy in reflection about one specific problem. And then you have this confrontation between all these different ideas and arguments. And so it's a kind of an emulation of the best that comes up in a certain way in these kind of moments. So I'm very much for the organization of competitions when you have challenging projects to make. Actually, this is it also avoids how do you call this, favoritism or political corruption and all these kind of things. So because it's an open structure, it's controlled, it's public. So I think this is a good evolution in the last 20 years in these regions.
And what is the connection between the urban designers and landscape designers who participate in the competitions and the flood control engineers who are responsible? Well, maybe the liability structure is different in Europe, but here it's, the engineers are basically liable for the flood control. They have to build flood control, but that's their responsibility. So what is kind of the connection between the two?
Well, everybody has its own function, actually, its own responsibility. The designer makes the functional things accessible in a certain way, or makes it accessible to a public use, makes it more beautiful, and also makes it more acceptable sometimes. There's, as I was saying in the beginning, so much infrastructure that was put on the wrong side or on the wrong place, and or in the wrong way, where, because this is not, I mean, this is very delicate, because it's not about errors, but I think everybody has its own task and its own skills. And engineers are very functional, and they go from A to B through a straight line. But sometimes a straight line is not the shortest line. So, and sometimes designers will find the shortest line between A and B. And that's where the collaboration between engineers and designers and other people, I mean, in some projects you need developers, or you need, I don't know, sometimes you have also writers or photographers which are involved in projects. It depends on what kind of project you are making. And so just to say that the architect and the designer is working in a completely other way than the engineer. And there is a scientific and applied sciences way of working, and there is a way of working which is another kind of economy, you can say, in an economy with other means. And sometimes it's very difficult that these two groups should find each other. But it works. It works, and when it works, the result is absolutely fabulous, because it's all about, to use a big word, the genius of the engineer and the genius of the design. When they find each other, then you have a perfect project, actually. So and in competitions, this becomes possible, because you can impose in competitions that the team should be made out of architect, designers, engineers, landscape architects, even sometimes researchers in I don't know, biology, or so. It depends on the constitution of the team, and when you can impose those composition or constitution of the teams, you can also impose a kind of quality of the result. So yeah, I think that's a lesson that is learned now also by many authorities and governments, that this is a kind of a step forward to a qualiful environment, and not just a functional environment. So I think it's really important. It has to do also with public space in the very large definition and sense of public. That what happens is part of public life. It's part of everybody. The environment is not from the one or the other. It's from all of us. And so if we intervene in the environment, it should also be an intervention where everybody takes its own responsibility. So not only the architect, but also not only the technician, and also the residents and inhabitants which can participate or have to participate in the decision making. It's so important. To give an example about Antwerp again, I showed you in this picture, this drawing, where you have all the polders inundated around Antwerp with the siege of Antwerp. So these are very low lands by definition. And then the modern port arrives in the early 20th century. And in order to make the port in those areas, they had to raise the level of the polders. So they've put cubic meters or cubic kilometers of sand on those areas to raise the level with 6 or 7 meters. That means that several villages are now disappeared under those layers of land, of new land. At this moment, I mean, there is now a kind of a reaction, and some of these villages are still visible, and they live like in a kind of a pit, almost deeper than the artificial level. So they are fighting for their rights to exist, and this is what I mean with the public dimension of design. That the decision in the 70s to raise square kilometers of land to dig out canals for the port is a decision that was a pure technocratic decision. So now they are coming back on that kind of decisions, and they want to make the best again of what is still possible of those decisions to yeah, in a kind of a public perspective of the interest of all. So that's really interesting to see what happens today and in the last years in connection or in perspective of what happened 50 years ago. I mean, we are in another period, and with all the problems, the climate crisis, and all the disappearance of biodiversity and things like that, we really need to not only to do scientific research, but also to learn to decide on how we will apply scientific research in our environment. So I think this is really also an interesting period, I think, from that point of view.
Yeah, I totally agree. I didn't have any other specific questions for you. Is there anything else that you want to touch on before we sign off here?
Oh, I think this is a conversation that can go on a long time, but I must say I was, or I am very pleased to participate in this conversation, and so I hope that there will be that there will come out something out of the water webinar series and of this kind of conversations, so that we can step up another level of cooperation and collaboration. I think this is something which is really, from my side, deeply wished, I would say, as a result of what we are doing now.
Yeah, I
so thank you a lot
agree.
for the conversation.
Yeah, thank you. It's great to speak with you, and I have learned so much. So thank you. I really appreciate it, and I hope we can keep these conversations going.
Thanks a lot, Sasha. You're welcome.
All right. Have a good day.
Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.